The courthouse stood tall against the gray morning sky, its stone pillars weathered yet imposing, like silent guardians of truth. Inside, a crowd had already gathered long before the judge's gavel was due to strike. Journalists filled the benches with notepads ready. Families of both sides whispered nervously, and the jury sat in rigid silence, their expressions tense, knowing the weight of what they were about to witness. But amid all the chaos, the focus of every eye was not on the lawyers, not even on the judge. It was on a small, fragile figure who barely understood the world she had been thrust into. The girl was only 3 years old, with wide, watchful eyes that revealed both innocence and unspeakable pain. She sat in a high-backed wooden chair near the witness stand, legs too short to touch the ground, her small hands gripping a stuffed toy that had been allowed into the courtroom for comfort. Her hair was tied neatly by her mother earlier that morning, but stray strands had already fallen across her forehead. She looked almost angelic, yet something in her silence felt haunting. For months, this little girl had not spoken a single word. Not to her mother, not to the kind counselors who had sat with her, and not even in sleep. Her trauma had stolen her voice, locking it away deep inside, leaving only silence in its place. And today, that silence weighed heavier than ever before, because this courtroom depended on it. The case was unlike any other. At its center sat the defendant, a man whose very presence darkened the room. He wore a pressed suit, his hands folded neatly on the table, but his eyes gave away a shadow of arrogance. He leaned slightly toward his lawyer, whispering occasionally, with a smirk that unsettled everyone who caught it. To him, the girl's silence was his shield. Without her testimony, without her words, the evidence was thin. He knew it, his lawyer knew it, and the jury surely sensed it too. The prosecution had prepared meticulously, yet their case rested on a fragile hope that somehow the child would speak. The prosecutors had fought to allow alternative methods, introducing therapy dogs into the proceedings, a rare but not unheard of practice for cases involving children. At first, the defense had laughed at the idea, mocking the notion that a dog could change anything. But deep down, there was fear that even one word from that little girl could unravel their entire strategy. The judge, a stern yet compassionate figure with decades of experience, tapped his fingers lightly against the bench. His eyes softened when they glanced at the girl, but hardened instantly when they shifted toward the defendant. He knew this case was delicate, not just in law, but in human cost. The jury, too, leaned forward, caught between duty and empathy, every one of them aware that history was being written in that very room. The mother sat close by, wringing her hands, her face pale with exhaustion. She had watched her daughter slip into silence months earlier, her laughter replaced by vacant stares, her voice gone as if stolen by the night itself. She had begged, pleaded, and prayed for some sign of recovery, but none had come. Today, as she looked across the room at the man accused of shattering their lives, her chest tightened. She knew the odds, but she also knew something no lawyer or judge could measure: the bond between her daughter and a certain four-legged companion waiting just outside the doors. The air grew heavier as the bailiff prepared to open those doors. The shuffle of shoes echoed loudly, each sound magnified in the silence. Reporters leaned in closer, pens poised above paper. One juror adjusted his glasses nervously. Another clasped her hands as if in prayer. Every breath, every glance, every heartbeat seemed louder than it should have been. The child shifted in her seat, hugging her stuffed toy tighter, her lips pressed firmly shut, her eyes darting between her mother and the floor. The defense attorney, noticing the shift in atmosphere, leaned toward his client again. "Relax," he whispered, barely audible. "She won't talk. She hasn't said a word in months. The jury won't believe a child who breaks silence now. They'll think it's coached." His client nodded, the corner of his mouth twitching upward in a smug half-smile. But beneath that facade, a bead of sweat glistened on his temple. The prosecutor, on the other hand, sat straighter in his chair. His pen lay untouched beside his notes. He wasn't waiting for documents or cross-examinations. He was waiting for something intangible, something fragile yet stronger than any evidence truth, spoken from the lips of a child. He knew it was a gamble, one that could backfire if she remained silent. But in his heart, he believed. At last, the bailiff returned, hand resting on the leash of a large German shepherd. The dog's coat gleamed under the courtroom lights, and his steady eyes scanned the room with quiet intelligence. His name was Ranger, and he was no ordinary K9. Trained for comfort as well as protection, he had spent weeks meeting the little girl outside of court, patiently earning her trust. Where adults had failed, he had made progress. She hadn't spoken yet, but she had touched him, stroked his fur, even leaned against him for comfort. To the prosecution, this bond was their final hope. The moment Ranger entered, the room seemed to shift. Conversations died instantly, replaced by an almost reverent silence. His paws clicked softly against the polished wood floor, each step deliberate, measured, calm. He wasn't here to chase or attack, he was here to comfort. And somehow, everyone in the room felt it. The girl's eyes lifted at the sound. She froze, her toy slipping slightly from her grasp. Then recognition sparked. Her lips parted ever so slightly, though no sound emerged. Her tiny fingers twitched, as if reaching for something unseen. Her mother gasped softly, covering her mouth with trembling hands. Ranger moved closer, stopping just before her chair. He sat, his body steady, his head slightly tilted in a gesture of calm patience. He didn't move toward her, didn't demand attention. He simply waited, breathing steadily, letting her choose. The girl's hand hovered in the air, trembling, before finally brushing against his fur. It was a small touch, but in that moment, it was everything. The crowd inhaled sharply, the sound filling the courtroom like wind before a storm. The judge leaned forward ever so slightly, his usually impassive face softening. The prosecutor exhaled in relief. Even the defense lawyer faltered, his smug confidence slipping for the first time. The girl's hand lingered on Ranger's back. Her shoulders, once rigid, seemed to relax. She blinked slowly, her gaze no longer darting nervously, but locked onto the dog at her side. The silence of the courtroom stretched long, heavy, and expectant. And though she hadn't spoken yet, everyone in the room felt it, the beginning of something extraordinary. The walls of silence were cracking. The courtroom's heavy silence lingered long after Ranger padded into the room. For most, silence was nothing more than the absence of sound, but here it carried weight, an unbearable weight that smothered every heart present. And no silence was heavier than that of the 3-year-old girl who now sat beside the K9, her hand resting timidly on his fur. Her silence was not ordinary. It was not the playful stubbornness of a toddler refusing to answer. It was the silence of trauma, of memories too sharp for words, of a little soul shattered by something she could not fully understand. From the night of the incident, her voice had vanished. Before that night, she had been a chatterbox, the kind of child who sang to her dolls, asked endless questions, and filled rooms with laughter. But afterward, she had spoken not a single word. Her mother had tried desperately reading bedtime stories, singing lullabies, bringing her favorite toys. Nothing worked. Therapists had knelt before her, using dolls, drawings, even games to coax her. Still nothing. She had looked at them with wide, hollow eyes, lips pressed shut as though speaking was dangerous. It was not willful silence. It was survival. Psychologists explained that children sometimes retreated into muteness after witnessing trauma. It was the mind's way of locking the horror away, sealing it behind a door no one could open. And yet, behind that locked door, truth waited. Everyone knew the little girl carried it, but no one knew if she would ever release it. The defense attorney had built his entire strategy on that silence. In pre-trial hearings, he had smirked at the prosecution's attempts to use therapy dogs. "Dogs don't make witnesses," he had sneered. "They fetch sticks." He repeated that sentiment to the jury in opening statements, reminding them that no words had been heard from the child for months, and no reasonable person could place the fate of a man's freedom on the possibility of a toddler suddenly speaking. And yet, the prosecution had no choice but to gamble. The little girl sat in her chair, her toy still clutched in one hand, her other resting cautiously on Ranger. The courtroom watched in aching silence. Her lips parted once as though she might speak, but then she closed them again, shaking her head. A soft murmur passed through the spectators, quickly silenced by the judge's sharp gaze. Her mother leaned forward, whispering, "It's okay, baby. You're safe." The words were barely audible, but they trembled with hope. Tears brimmed in her eyes as she studied her daughter. It was not the first time she had said those words. She had whispered them night after night, sitting by her daughter's bed when sleep wouldn't come. But here, under the harsh fluorescent lights and the stares of strangers, they seemed less like a lullaby and more like a prayer. The little girl did not respond. Instead, she leaned closer to Ranger, burying her fingers deeper into his thick fur. Ranger remained calm, unmoving, radiating warmth. He did not push her, did not nuzzle her for attention. He simply stayed. The jury's eyes flickered between the girl and the dog. Some looked skeptical, others softened visibly. One older juror pressed his lips tightly, trying not to show the emotion stirring within him. A young woman on the panel blinked rapidly, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. They had been warned to remain impartial, but this scene tugged at something beyond legal duty. It touched their humanity. Meanwhile, the defense attorney scribbled furiously on his notepad, his smirk faltering. He whispered to his client, "She won't talk. Just keep calm." But the defendant shifted uneasily, his jaw tightening, a bead of sweat rolling down his neck. Perhaps for the first time, he realized that silence was fragile, that one word could shatter it forever. The prosecutor remained patient, his gaze steady on the child. He didn't speak, didn't try to coax. He had studied her patterns, learned from therapists who said pushing her too hard would only drive her deeper into silence. Instead, he waited, trusting Ranger to do what no adult could. The silence stretched on. Seconds felt like minutes, minutes like hours. The sound of a cough in the gallery echoed like thunder. The hum of the fluorescent lights buzzed in everyone's ears. Still, the girl said nothing. But then something subtle happened. She shifted in her seat, her body angling slightly toward the dog. Her small fingers, instead of hovering nervously, began stroking his fur rhythmically. Her lips moved just slightly, as though she were forming a word in her head, but not yet letting it escape. Her mother gasped softly, clasping her hands together. The prosecutor leaned forward imperceptibly, heart pounding. The judge tilted his head, watching intently. Even the defense attorney paused his scribbling. The girl opened her mouth. A faint sound escaped too soft to distinguish. It could have been breath. It could have been the start of a word. But then she closed it again, her shoulders tensing, her body retreating inward. The courtroom sighed in unison, a wave of disappointment rolling through the benches. The defense attorney regained his confidence, whispering again to his client, "See? Nothing. She can't do it." The defendant smirked weakly, but his fingers drummed nervously on the table. The little girl hugged her stuffed toy tighter, eyes darting briefly toward the defendant. For a fleeting moment, her expression shifted, fear flashed across her face. She looked down quickly, burying her face into Ranger's side. And then, though her lips did not yet form words, a sound left her throat. It was not language, it was a whimper. A broken, trembling sound that echoed louder than words could. The room fell utterly still. The sound pierced every heart, reminding them of what this child had endured. Her mother burst into quiet tears, covering her face with her hands. One juror clenched his fist tightly. Another dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The prosecutor closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. The defense attorney leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. For the first time, his confidence faltered visibly. He realized that even if the girl never said a word, the jury had just heard something undeniable, the sound of pain, raw and unfiltered. But the child wasn't done. She lifted her face from Ranger's fur and looked straight at him. Her lips trembled, opening just slightly. A whisper formed, too faint for most to hear, but those closest caught it. "Doggy?" It was the first word she had spoken in months. Not directed at the lawyers, not at the judge, not even at her mother. It was for Ranger. A mother gasped loudly, pressing her hand to her mouth. The prosecutor sat upright, his heart racing. The judge's stern face cracked, just barely, into something softer. Gasps rippled across the courtroom, though quickly hushed. It wasn't testimony. It wasn't enough to convict anyone. But it was proof that her silence was breaking. And once silence cracked, words could follow. The defense attorney stammered, trying to regain control. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, children often say meaningless words. That doesn't mean anything. It's not about the case," but no one was listening to him. They were all watching the girl, their hearts locked on the moment they had just witnessed. She hadn't said the words everyone hoped, for not yet. But she had spoken. And in that courtroom, those two syllables, "doggy," were nothing short of a miracle. The silence, for the first time in months, had been broken. The door to the courtroom creaked open again, and with it came a shift in the atmosphere. All eyes turned toward the bailiff, who walked slowly down the aisle with a leash in hand. At the end of the leash-padded Ranger, the police K9, his movements calm and deliberate. He was a large German shepherd, his fur sleek under the fluorescent lights, his stride confident yet unhurried. Unlike the people in the room, who fidgeted, whispered, and shifted nervously, Ranger radiated composure. The sound of his nails clicking against the polished wood floor echoed strangely loud in the tense silence. Every head swiveled to follow him, every chest tightened with anticipation. Some spectators leaned forward, others gasped softly, as though the mere presence of the dog carried weight beyond measure. This wasn't an ordinary courtroom scene. It felt different, as if something sacred was unfolding. The little girl's eyes lifted the moment she heard the sound. She had been curled slightly into herself, clutching her stuffed toy like a shield, but the click of Ranger's paws made her head snap up. Recognition sparked in her gaze, soft but undeniable. She had met Ranger before, in quiet therapy sessions outside the courthouse. He had been the one presence she allowed near her, the one creature she trusted when words would not come. Now, here he was. Her lips parted, though no sound came. Her small hands loosened their grip on the toy. The stuffed animal sagged against her lap as her fingers hovered uncertainly, as if torn between holding on to fear and reaching for comfort. The bailiff stopped beside the witness stand, unclipping Ranger's leash. The dog sat immediately, his posture disciplined, his eyes sweeping calmly across the room before resting on the child. He didn't rush to her, didn't move closer than allowed. Instead, he waited patient, steady, grounded. It was the kind of presence that required no words, no commands. A judge watched intently, his chin resting on one hand. This wasn't procedure, not in the strictest sense. But he had allowed it for a reason. He had seen enough children broken by silence, enough trials derailed by the absence of a voice. If this dog could do what therapy and persuasion could not, then justice demanded it. The jury, too, was riveted. 12 people leaned forward almost as one, their eyes fixed on the fragile child and the calm dog before her. Some looked skeptical, their brows furrowed. Others appeared moved already, their expressions softened by the simple sight of the girl's trembling hand inching forward. Her mother covered her mouth with both hands, tears brimming in her eyes. She knew what this meant. For weeks, she had sat in rooms where therapists tried everything: pictures, games, dolls, and failed. But with Ranger, her daughter had reached out willingly, had pressed her cheek against his fur, as if he were the only safe thing in the world. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He scribbled something on his notepad, but the pen scratched too hard against the paper, betraying his unease. He leaned toward the defendant, whispering, "Don't panic. It's just a dog. They can't get testimony from a dog." His words were confident, but his voice betrayed him. The defendant nodded stiffly, but his jaw clenched. His eyes flicked to the little girl, then to the dog. His smirk was gone, replaced by a nervous tightness around his mouth. For the first time since the trial began, the balance of power shifted ever so slightly. The prosecutor remained silent, his hands folded neatly on the table. He didn't speak, didn't prompt, didn't even move. This wasn't the moment for lawyers. This was the moment for truth to breathe on its own. A girl's hand trembled as it hovered in the air. Her fingers opened, closed, opened again. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath with her. The sound of a chair creaking in the gallery was so loud that the judge shot a sharp glance to silence it instantly. And then her hand touched him. Her small fingers brushed against Ranger's fur, tentative at first, then lingering. A gasp rippled through the courtroom, quiet but unmistakable. The dog didn't flinch, didn't turn his head. He simply stayed, allowing her touch, radiating the steady patience of a guardian. The girl's shoulders relaxed. Her lips parted again, though no words came. Still, the change was visible, undeniable. She had shifted from fear to connection, from silence to the edge of speech. Her mother sobbed quietly, pressing tissues to her face. A juror wiped his own eyes. Another leaned back, exhaling shakily. Even the judge's stern features softened, his gaze steady on the child's trembling hand buried in the dog's fur. For the defense, it was a disaster. They had counted on her silence, on her fear. But fear was unraveling, replaced by something stronger. They knew it, and the jury knew it too. Ranger lowered his head slightly, resting his chin near the child's knee. The movement was slow, deliberate, an offering of comfort. The girl's eyes widened at the gesture, and for the first time in months, something that looked like trust flickered across her face. The silence stretched, but it was no longer heavy. It was expectant, alive. Somewhere in the gallery, a reporter scribbled furiously, capturing every second. They knew this moment would become a headline, perhaps even a turning point in legal history. Not because of cross-examinations or dramatic speeches, but because of the quiet bond between a wounded child and a loyal dog. The defense attorney rose abruptly, objecting. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The child has been primed to respond to this animal. This isn't credible testimony, it's theatrics." The judge's gavel cracked once. "Sit down, counselor. This court will allow the process to continue." His voice carried no room for argument. The defense attorney sank back into his chair, his face flushed. The child stroked Ranger's fur again, slower this time, as if grounding herself. Her lips moved once more, silent but shaping a word. The courtroom leaned forward collectively, straining to hear. No sound emerged, but the intent was clear. She wanted to speak. Her mother leaned forward, whispering gently, "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe. He's here for you." Ranger stayed steady, his body warm and unmoving, his eyes locked gently on the child. And then the faintest sound escaped her lips, a breath, a whisper, not yet words, but closer than ever before. The courtroom froze. It was the beginning of something unstoppable. The K9 had not only entered the courtroom, he had entered her heart, breaking down the walls of silence, brick by fragile brick. Everyone present knew the truth was on its way. The courtroom had grown so still that even the hum of the overhead lights seemed intrusive. Ranger lay calmly at the little girl's feet, his steady breathing grounding her in a way no human voice ever could. The child's tiny fingers were still tangled in his fur, her wide eyes fixed on him as if he were her anchor in a storm she couldn't describe. For weeks, months even, silence had defined her. It was more than absence. It was her fortress. Behind it, she had hidden from memories too painful, from sights too terrifying, from a world that had become unsafe. Every therapist, every counselor, every whispered plea from her mother had failed to pull her out. But now, here she was, in the witness stand, surrounded by strangers, facing the man whose presence carried the weight of her fear. And for the first time, her silence wavered. The jury leaned forward, breathless. The judge, usually stoic, perched slightly at the edge of his seat. The prosecutor's heart pounded in his chest as he dared not speak, not even to encourage her. To interrupt this fragile moment would be to risk shattering it entirely. The defense attorney, on the other hand, stiffened in his chair. His fingers tightened around his pen until his knuckles whitened. He had built his case on the certainty of her silence. And if that silence broke, if she spoke even a single word, it could destroy him. The child's lips parted. At first, there was only the faintest sound, barely more than breath, like a leaf rustling in the wind. Those closest strained to hear, uncertain if it was merely an exhale or the beginning of speech. The little girl swallowed hard, her shoulders trembling. Her hand clenched in Ranger's fur, as though drawing strength from him. And then she spoke. Two small words, fragile yet clear enough to pierce through every barrier in the room. "Bad man." She pointed across the courtroom, her trembling finger extending toward the defendant. For a moment, time itself seemed to freeze. The jury gasped collectively, a sharp intake of breath that filled the room like thunder. Spectators clutched at their mouths, eyes wide in disbelief. The mother broke down completely, sobbing openly, her body shaking as years of grief and hope collided all at once. Even the judge, seasoned and unshakable after decades on the bench, blinked rapidly, his gavel lowering slowly, as though he had forgotten it was in his hand. The defendant jolted in his seat. His smug expression vanished, replaced by shock, then anger. He leaned toward his attorney, whispering harshly, but his voice trembled. Sweat gathered on his brow. No one had ever seen him look so undone. The defense attorney scrambled, rising to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor," he shouted, his voice cracking under pressure. "This is unreliable. She's a child. She's been influenced. This can't stand as credible testimony." But no one seemed to hear him. Not the jury, who stared with wide, unblinking eyes. Not the gallery, who buzzed with shocked whispers, despite the bailiff's attempts to restore order. And not even the judge, who leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the child, as though the rest of the courtroom had vanished. The little girl's voice had been small, her words simple. But in those two words, "bad man," she had spoken more powerfully than hours of cross-examination or mountains of paperwork ever could. Her silence had been her prison. Her voice had become her weapon. The room erupted. Gasps, cries, whispers. The gavel struck the bench, once, twice, 3 times, demanding order. Silence in the court. The judge thundered, though even his voice trembled with the enormity of what had just happened. The mother, still sobbing, reached forward instinctively, as if to wrap her arms around her daughter, but she stopped herself. This moment belonged to the child, to her courage, to her words. Ranger pressed closer, resting his head gently against her knee. The child leaned into him, her trembling slowing, her small chest rising and falling, as though releasing a burden she had carried too long. She did not retract her words. She did not look away. Her eyes stayed fixed on the defendant. The defendant shifted uncomfortably, his composure gone. For the first time, he looked smaller than the child who had just spoken against him. He clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists, his face paling as though he felt the weight of every gaze in the room burning into him. The prosecutor exhaled, steadying himself. This was it. The breakthrough he had prayed for. He hadn't expected it to be so sudden, so dramatic, so final. 2 words, just 2, but they carried the weight of truth undeniable. The defense attorney tried again, voice shrill. Your Honor, I must insist, this is inadmissible, this is... The judge silenced him with a glare. Counselor, you will sit down immediately. The court will decide the weight of the testimony. His voice was cold steel. The attorney sank back into his chair, defeated for the moment. The courtroom buzzed like a living thing, hearts racing, eyes damp, breaths caught. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something historic. Not a lawyer's clever argument, not a dramatic reveal of evidence, but the voice of a child long buried, now finally freed. The girl's mother reached forward again, this time gently touching her daughter's shoulder. The child turned her head slightly, her eyes softer now, her lips trembling but no longer sealed shut. For the first time in months, she had spoken. And she had spoken the truth. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every second. Already, headlines were forming in their minds. Child breaks silence in courtroom, points to defendant with 2 words. Knew the world would gasp just as the courtroom had. But for those inside the room, the shock was not about headlines. It was about witnessing courage, the kind of courage that could only come from innocence fighting through fear. Ranger remained still, his eyes calm, his presence unshakable. In that moment, he was more than a service dog. He was her shield, her anchor, her bridge back to the world of words. And as the echoes of gasps and murmurs died down, the truth lingered in the air like an unshakable force. 2 words. That was all it had taken to change everything. The echo of the child's words still hung in the air, like smoke after a gunshot. Bad man? The 2 syllables had landed heavier than a gavel, reverberating in every corner of the courtroom. For a moment, silence pressed down on the chamber with suffocating weight, as though the building itself needed to catch its breath. Then, like a dam breaking, the room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, cries. Jurors exchanged stunned looks, some leaning forward, others glancing at one another with wide, unblinking eyes. One woman on the panel covered her mouth with trembling fingers, tears brimming as if she had just witnessed a miracle. Another juror, a man who had kept his arms crossed in skeptical detachment from much of the trial, now sat bolt upright, his expression softened by something that looked very much like belief. The spectator section stirred with hushed chaos. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, pens scratching paper, while a few spectators clutched one another in shock. The sound of whispers swelled like a tide until the judge, visibly shaken himself, raised his gavel and slammed it down with force. Order! His voice thundered, though it cracked ever so slightly. Order in this courtroom. Even then, the murmurs didn't die entirely. Some shocks are too profound to be silenced with wood and authority. The little girl sat frozen on the stand, her small hand still resting on Ranger's back. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, but her eyes, wide, wet, and unwavering, remained locked on the defendant. She had spoken the words that had haunted her dreams, and though her voice had been soft, the truth in it roared louder than anything else in the room. Her mother wept openly, her face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking with sobs of both relief and sorrow. Months of hopeless silence, of fearing she'd never hear her daughter's voice again, had ended in the most unexpected and powerful way. Between the sobs, she whispered prayers of thanks, gratitude spilling out in fragments. The prosecutor, who had kept his composure through every twist of the trial, felt his throat tighten. He had strategized for weeks, mapped every angle, but no preparation could compare to what had just unfolded. This wasn't evidence, it was revelation. He dared not speak yet, afraid of shattering the fragile miracle. The defense attorney, on the other hand, nearly leapt from his chair. His face was pale, beads of sweat forming at his temple. "Objection!" he shouted, his voice too shrill, betraying desperation. "This testimony, this cannot be considered reliable. She's a child, Your Honor, a traumatized one. Clearly, she's been coached." The judge fixed him with a glare so sharp it could cut glass. "Counselor, sit down." "But Your Honor, sit down." The gavel struck again. The courtroom vibrated with finality. The defense attorney, lips pressed tight, obeyed, sinking heavily into his chair. He shuffled his papers, though it was clear his mind was elsewhere. His entire strategy had been gutted in a matter of seconds. The defendant himself sat stiff, no longer the picture of arrogance he had displayed throughout the trial. His smirk had vanished, replaced with a grimace. His jaw clenched, and his eyes darted from juror to juror as if searching for a lifeline that no longer existed. His hands balled into fists, knuckles white, as if physical tension could hold together what was already unraveling. Ranger, the K-9, shifted slightly at the child's side, his head tilting up as if sensing her need for reassurance. He pressed against her leg, grounding her once more. The girl leaned into him, fingers digging into his fur, her trembling beginning to ease. For the first time since entering the room, her posture wasn't only fear, carried something else. Strength. The jury, though silent, were already moved beyond argument. They had witnessed what words couldn't fully explain, the breaking of silence, the unleashing of truth. The judge leaned forward, speaking in measured tones, though his eyes betrayed his own awe. "A testimony has been given. The court will proceed, and its weight will be considered by the jury." His gavel came down one more time, but the echoes of the child's voice had already lodged themselves permanently in the hearts of those present. The prosecutor finally rose, his tone calm, respectful, almost reverent. "Your Honor, the people have no further questions for this witness." It was rare, so rare, for a prosecutor to simply stop, especially at such a critical juncture. But he knew there was no need to press. The truth had spoken for itself. The mother covered her mouth again, sobbing harder. The bailiff stepped forward instinctively, not to intervene, but to offer steadiness as the weight of the moment pressed heavily across the room. The jurors whispered among themselves during the brief recess that followed. Some spoke of goosebumps, of tears they hadn't expected. Others admitted quietly that whatever doubts they had carried into the room had been dissolved by the two words they'd just heard. Meanwhile, the defense huddled with his client, whispering fiercely, though it was clear panic had crept into both their faces. Every objection, every technicality, every carefully built argument had just been overshadowed by the raw and undeniable voice of a child. The child herself leaned down, whispering something softly into Ranger's ear. No one else heard it, but the way his tail thumped once against the floor suggested it was something gentle, perhaps even brave. She rested her cheek against his fur, finally allowing herself the comfort she had denied for so long. The judge eventually called the court back to order. The trial had to continue, Evidence still had to be presented. Procedures followed. But the tone of the room had shifted irrevocably. Everyone knew it. Justice had taken a step forward the moment the little girl raised her hand and spoke. And though the defense would fight tooth and nail in the hours to come, the truth had already been planted firmly in the hearts of 12 jurors. Bad man. 2 words that shattered silence, pierced lies, and set the course of the trial on a path no argument could undo. The courtroom still carried the echoes of those 2 words, bad man. The jury had gasped, the spectators had wept, and the prosecution had silently thanked fate. But for the defense, it was a catastrophe. The moment the child's trembling finger pointed across the courtroom, months of preparation collapsed like a house of cards in a storm. The defense attorney sat stiff in his chair, hands pressed flat against the table, mind racing faster than his heartbeat. He had built his case on silence. A child too young, too traumatized, incapable of speaking. A jury who might sympathize, yes, but who would never hear her voice. That had been his shield. Now it was gone. Counselor? The judge's voice cut through the fog. You may proceed with cross-examination. The attorney hesitated, his throat dry. Cross-examine a 3-year-old? A fragile child who had just spoken her first words in months in front of the entire court? It was a trap, no matter which way he turned. Attack too harshly, and he would appear cruel. Tread too lightly, and her words would stand unchallenged. Still, he rose, straightening his tie as though that small act could restore control. Your Honor, he began, with all due respect, I move to strike the child's words from the record. She is too young, clearly traumatized, and incapable of distinguishing truth from suggestion. The judge's gavel struck once. Motion denied. Proceed. The attorney's jaw tightened. He turned toward the witness stand. The little girl sat with Ranger at her feet, her small hand buried in his fur. She looked impossibly small, dwarfed by the weight of the courtroom, yet the silence surrounding her gave her a quiet authority no adult could match. The attorney stepped closer, his voice measured. Sweetheart, he said, forcing a gentle tone, you said. Bad man, did someone tell you to say that? The girl blinked, lips trembling, but she shook her head slowly. The attorney's smile faltered. He tried again. Did your mommy tell you to point at him? Or maybe the nice police officers? Another small shake of the head. The jury leaned forward, watching intently. The attorney could feel their eyes, their judgment. He adjusted his papers, pressing on. Sometimes, he continued carefully, children get scared and say things that aren't true. Did someone tell you that man was bad? This time, the girl's eyes darted to Ranger. Her tiny fingers tightened in his fur, drawing courage from his steady presence. She shook her head again, firmer this time. The defense attorney felt sweat bead at his temple. The child was winning without saying more than a gesture. He needed something, anything, to regain ground. Your Honor, he said, pivoting. Clearly, this child is incapable of providing reliable testimony. Psychological experts will confirm that children of her age are highly suggestible. She has been surrounded by adults who believe the defendant is guilty. It is no surprise she repeated what she has heard. The prosecutor shot to his feet. Objection. She has not repeated anything she spoke for herself, for the first time in months. The judge nodded. Sustained. The jury will disregard counsel's speculation. The attorney swallowed hard. He turned back to the child, but he no longer saw a silent, malleable witness. He saw a fortress. Her silence had once been his greatest weapon, but her voice, soft, trembling, and painfully honest, was something he couldn't tear down. He tried one last time, desperation seeping into his voice. Honey, sometimes people we don't like aren't really bad. Maybe you were just scared. Is it possible? Maybe you pointed at the wrong man? The courtroom froze. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. The little girl's lips parted. She didn't whisper this time. Her voice, though still small, was clear enough for every ear to hear. No. A single word landed like a hammer blow. Jurors exchanged glances, some nodding faintly, as though the child's quiet conviction spoke louder than any lawyer's argument. The prosecutor leaned back in his chair, his eyes glimmering with restrained triumph. The mother wept again, covering her face. The defense attorney's shoulders slumped. He had lost. Not the trial, at least not yet, but the moment. The jury's hearts had shifted, and there was no turning them back. The judge dismissed the witness, allowing the bailiff to escort the child and range her gently from the stand. The little girl clung to the leash, her small frame leaning into the dog as though she carried not only her own weight, but the truth of the entire case. When the door closed behind her, the courtroom exhaled. The prosecutor rose immediately. "Your Honor, the people would like to call our next witness." But the defense attorney barely heard. His mind churned, searching desperately for strategy. He would bring in experts, psychologists, anyone who could undermine her credibility. He would argue that memory is fragile, that children cannot distinguish dreams from reality, that suggestibility taints everything. He had to, yet deep down, he knew the truth. The jury hadn't just heard her voice, they had felt it. 2 words had carried the weight of honesty that 100 witnesses could not match. The trial would continue. Motions would be filed. Evidence would be debated. But the tide had shifted, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. The defense could scramble all it wanted, but no amount of argument could erase the memory of a child pointing her finger and saying the words that shattered silence. "Bad man." The echo lingered still, louder than any objection. The courtroom had returned to a semblance of order, but the tension remained palpable, hanging in the air like a thick fog. Every eye seemed fixed on the jury, whose 12 members had retired to deliberate mere moments ago. They carried with them the weight of months of testimony, evidence, and the unforgettable moment when a 3-year-old had pointed and spoken 2 words that shattered silence. "Bad man." The halls outside the courtroom were quiet, but buzzing with subdued conversation. Reporters whispered to one another, sharing fragmented accounts of what had happened, their words hushed in reverence and awe. The little girl and ranger had been escorted safely to a quiet room, away from the public eye. They were a sanctuary in a storm of legal chaos, the child resting against the dog's warm body, her small hands clutching fur that had become her shield. Inside, the defense attorney paced, jaw tight, fingers tapping nervously against the polished wood of the conference room table. He had spent the past hour going over every possible strategy, every shred of evidence, every conceivable way to sway the jury back in his client's favor. Yet, in the pit of his stomach, he knew it was futile. The child's words, so simple yet potent, had pierced through every layer of pretense, every calculated argument he had prepared. Meanwhile, the prosecutor sat quietly, a subtle sense of calm emanating from him. He had done his part. He had guided the proceedings, maintained protocol, and allowed the child's voice to speak truth where adults had failed. Now it was in the hands of 12 ordinary citizens, ordinary people who had been touched by something extraordinary. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, silently acknowledging the courage of a child who had endured so much. A jury deliberated for hours, their discussions a quiet storm behind closed doors. They debated evidence, recalled testimony, argued nuances of law, and yet kept returning, time and again, to the moment when the girl had pointed and said, "Bad man." Some of the jurors were mothers and fathers themselves, their hearts particularly attuned to the raw honesty of a child's voice. Others were people unaccustomed to being moved by anything but facts and logic. Yet even they couldn't ignore the undeniable courage that had spoken through those trembling lips. Hours stretched, and the courtroom waited. The clock ticked with agonizing slowness. Spectators shifted in their seats, glancing at the judge, then at one another. The defendant's face was a mask of controlled anger, though small betrayals of panic showed in the twitch of his eye, the tightening of his jaw. The defense attorney leaned forward, muttering quietly under his breath, recalculating strategies that had already failed. Finally, the jury emerged. 12 people, ordinary citizens who had carried an extraordinary burden, filed slowly into the courtroom. Every eye in the room followed them. The air was thick, the tension nearly unbearable. The judge rose, his face unreadable, though a subtle crease of anticipation marked his brow. The foreperson, a woman in her 40s, with an air of quiet authority, stepped forward. She held a piece of paper, her hands trembling slightly. The courtroom held its collective breath. Even the air seemed to pause. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor," the foreperson replied, her voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. The defendant's lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes darting nervously around the room. His attorney leaned close, whispering something inaudible, though his client barely heard it. The judge nodded. "Please hand the verdict to the clerk." The paper was passed forward, and the clerk read aloud, each word carrying the weight of months of tension, fear, and hope. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty as charged." Gasps erupted throughout the courtroom. Spectators clutched one another in relief. Some sobbed openly, and reporters jotted down every detail, knowing this moment would make headlines across the country. The mother wept openly, tears streaming down her cheeks as she hugged herself, overwhelmed by a mixture of grief, relief, and the long-awaited justice her daughter had inspired. The defendant's face paled. His composure had finally crumbled. The smirk, the arrogance, the defiance all gone, replaced by fear and disbelief. He looked around the room as though searching for someone to blame, but all eyes were fixed firmly on him. The truth had been revealed, not by lawyers, not by documents, but by a small child whose courage had pierced the darkness. Ranger, still beside the little girl, nudged her gently with his nose. She hugged him closer, as though the moment, though triumphant, had been exhausting. The bond between child and dog had carried her through the ordeal, grounding her when the world seemed overwhelmingly large and frightening. The judge nodded solemnly. "The court acknowledges the jury's verdict. Sentencing will follow according to the law." The courtroom exhaled as one. The weight that had pressed on every heart seemed to lift slightly, though the impact of what had occurred lingered in the air like an indelible mark. Every person present would remember this trial for the rest of their lives, not the arguments, not the exhibits, not the legal maneuvering, but the courage of a small child who spoke when silence had ruled for months. The defense attorney, slumped in his chair, muttered under his breath, barely audible, "It's over?" The prosecutor stood, allowing a small, respectful smile to cross his face. He didn't gloat. He didn't cheer. He simply acknowledged the moment, knowing that justice had been served in the most extraordinary way imaginable. Outside the courtroom, reporters scrambled to capture the scene. The story of the little girl who had broken her silence, pointing to the man and speaking two simple words, would travel far and wide. The headline would read not about the trial itself, but about courage, truth, and the unspoken bond between a child and her K-9 companion. Inside the courtroom, the mother bent down to her daughter, embracing her gently. "You did it," she whispered, tears streaming. "You spoke. You told the truth." The little girl hugged Ranger tightly, her small body still trembling slightly, though her eyes shone with newfound confidence. She had faced the unimaginable, had spoken when words seemed impossible, and had changed the course of justice forever. The defendant was led away, a defeated figure stripped of composure and dignity. His arrogance had been undone by a child's honesty, a simple truth that no argument, no lawyer, no trickery could obscure. And as the courtroom began to empty, as reporters scurried to file their stories and spectators whispered excitedly to one another, one fact remained clear. A moment had been historic. Not for the lawyers, not for the judges, not for the evidence, but for the child, the little girl who had found her voice, and for Ranger, the loyal K9 who had helped her speak it. In the hush that followed, a quiet awe lingered. Justice had been served, and the truth had spoken louder than any courtroom could contain. The courtroom had emptied, leaving behind only the echo of justice served and the faint scent of polished wood. The tension that had gripped every heart for weeks, months even, had finally lifted, replaced by a quiet, almost surreal calm. The little girl sat with her mother in a secluded room, Ranger lying beside her, his head resting gently on her lap. Her tiny fingers stroked his fur in slow, deliberate motions, a silent testament to the courage they had shared. It had been a long, harrowing journey. The girl's voice, silenced by trauma, had remained locked away for months. She had faced doctors, therapists, and countless adults who had tried to coax her to speak. And yet, it had taken something extraordinary, a loyal K9 companion, to break through the walls her young mind had built. Ranger had been more than a dog. He had been her anchor, her shield, and her bridge back to the world. Outside, reporters and cameras still swarmed the courthouse steps, but inside, the child's world was quiet and protected. Her mother held her close, whispering words of comfort and pride. "You did it, baby. You spoke the truth. You're so brave." The little girl looked up at her mother, her eyes shining, lips parting as if she might speak again. Ranger pressed his nose against her hand, encouraging her gently. Slowly she whispered, "Safe now." Her mother's heart swelled with relief. Tears fell freely as she hugged her daughter tighter. "Yes, sweetie. You're safe now. No one can hurt you anymore." The impact of those words, though simple, was profound. They marked a turning point, not just for the case, but for the little girl's life. The silence that had defined her existence was broken, replaced by words that carried truth, courage, and the promise of healing. Meanwhile, the defendant had been taken into custody. His expression was pale, disbelief etched into every line of his face. He had faced countless charges before, but none had been undone so thoroughly by the simple honesty of a child. The arrogance that had once filled him was gone, replaced by fear, frustration, and a dawning recognition that he could no longer control the narrative. The defense attorney, his hands trembling, gathered his papers and left quietly, knowing that no appeal could erase the moment when a child had spoken truth. No legal loophole could undo the power of those two words. Outside the courtroom, the world waited. Reporters captured every detail, crafting stories of courage, honesty, and the remarkable bond between a child and her K9 companion. Headlines splashed across newspapers, websites, and television screens. 3-year-old breaks silence in court, points out accused, courage of a child. Justice served through 2 words. K9 companion helps child speak the truth. But the story wasn't just about headlines. It was about healing. The little girl, who had endured more than anyone should at her age, had reclaimed her voice. The trauma that had silenced her was now confronted, not with fear, but with bravery. Ranger remained her steadfast support, his presence a reminder that she was never alone. In the following days, the mother sought therapy for her daughter, not to unlock her voice anymore, but to help her process the courage she had already shown. Sessions focused on understanding her feelings, on trusting her instincts, and on celebrating every small victory. Each time the girl spoke, her words carried weight and confidence, a testament to the power of support and patience. Ranger became a local hero. Police officers and therapists alike praised the K9 for his unwavering patience, his ability to connect with the child, and the critical role he had played in the case. Children's hospitals invited him for demonstrations, teaching young patients that sometimes bravery comes in unexpected forms, and that help can arrive in the shape of fur, paws, and unconditional loyalty. The little girl, for her part, grew gradually more confident. Words came slowly at first, stilted and tentative, but each one built upon the last. Conversations at home became longer, laughter returned to bedtime stories, and the fear that had once gripped her heart loosened its hold. Her mother watched every small step with pride, knowing that the child's courage had not just secured justice, but also reclaimed her life. Months later, the family returned to the courthouse for Ranger's formal recognition ceremony. The K9 received a medal for his service, and the little girl standing beside him whispered softly, "Good dog." The audience, including reporters, officers, and jurors from the trial, watched with warmth and admiration. The room erupted in applause, not just for the dog, but for the small, brave child whose voice had changed everything. The defendant's sentence was carried out according to the law, a direct result of the evidence supported by the child's bravery. Justice, though delayed and hard-won, had finally been served. Yet for the mother and daughter, the victory was not just legal, it was personal. It was the reclamation of a voice, a life, and a sense of safety that trauma had once stripped away. Even years later, the story remained vivid in the minds of those who had witnessed it. The image of a small girl, trembling but determined, pointing to the man who had caused her pain, while her loyal K9 companion sat faithfully by her side, became a symbol of courage and the power of trust. Children and adults alike were inspired by the tale, reminded that bravery doesn't always roar, it often whispers, supported by patience, love, and unwavering loyalty. For the little girl, the trial became a turning point, not just a legal battle. She learned that words could protect, heal, and transform. She learned that fear could be confronted, and that silence could be broken. And she learned that sometimes a four-legged friend could be the bridge between trauma and triumph, between fear and courage, between despair and hope. Ranger remained by her side, not out of duty, but out of loyalty and love. He was a constant reminder that bravery sometimes comes quietly, in the small gestures of connection, trust, and companionship. Together, they had faced the unimaginable, and together they had emerged stronger, their bond unshakable. In the quiet moments at home, long after the cameras were gone and the courtroom emptied, the little girl would sit with Ranger at her feet, whispering stories of her day, her thoughts, and even her dreams. And Ranger, ever patient, would listen, grounding her in a world that now felt safe, where words could flow, laughter could return, and fear no longer ruled. The trial was over, the verdict delivered, the justice served. But the true victory lay in the reclaiming of a voice long silenced, in the resilience of a child, and in the unwavering loyalty of a K9 companion who had helped her speak the truth when it mattered most. And in that victory, hope and courage thrived, forever entwined in the heart of a little girl who found her voice, and in the gentle, steadfast presence of a dog who helped her find it.